So we left off, we had talked about how selection in like high-dimensional systems naturally selects for compressibility.
Yeah.
We then talked about modularity as a particular thing that I would probably select for by selecting for reuse. And we talked a bit about this kind of hand-wavy duality between scarcity of modules and scarcity of channels. Next thing I want to cover is factorization of problem domains. So we notice that when humans are reasoning, they tend to like factor things. Like if you have a problem, you tend to branch off subproblems. If you have the world, you tend to break it up into pieces that you can model more or less separately. So we want to talk a bit about like sort of general features of how that works and what it looks like.
Okay.
So few different ways we can frame this that sort of bring different messages out of it. I'm going to start with a picture of a maze. So let me draw a maze real quick here. Okay, so we've got this maze. It doesn't really matter where we're starting, what the start or end points are for now. And I'm going to draw attention to some particular walls in the maze. So look at these guys right here.
Okay.
What's interesting about that? So first of all, if I have a start and end point on opposite sides of that wall. So let's say, for instance, I'm starting right here and I want to end right there.
Yeah.
Then I know I've essentially broken the problem into two pieces. I know that I need to go through that gap right there.
Yep.
So I can split it into first, I have a problem getting from here to there, and then I have a problem getting from there to the end. All right.
Right.
Notable thing about this, let's call it a heuristic, this factorization, this way of breaking the problem up, is that I can use it for lots of different problems in this maze, right?
Yep.
If instead my start is here and my end is there, I can still use it. If instead my start is here and my end is there, I can still say, all right, get rid of the top half of the maze, don't go up there, right? So I can use the same heuristic for lots of different problems in this maze. But if I go to a different maze, then it's useless.
Okay. Yeah.
So
I mean, the key feature here is that there's only one gap in the wall.
Mhm.
If there's more than one gap, then that it stops being true. Or
uh,
stops being a useful heuristic.
it would still be useful, but quantitatively less useful because you don't know which gap you have to go through. But you can still say like, well, I'm going to have to get to one of these two.
And also, if you are going from one side, if you're wanting to get from a place on one side to a place on the other, you maybe go up through the gap.
Yes, that's, yep. Yeah.
Around. But yeah, okay.
Right, so the key thing I want to emphasize about this guy is that it's a sort of reasoning tool, a heuristic or a problem factorization, that's specific to a particular environment, a particular maze, but general with respect to which problem you're solving. It applies to lots of different problems within that same maze.
Yep.
Right. And I want to claim that this is the sort of typical case for heuristics or problem factorizations of the sort that we use. Is they tend to be environment specific, but problem general. So most of them won't work if you move to a sufficiently different environment, but will work on lots of different problems in the same environment.
What's an example of a heuristic that you have in mind for? Yeah. What should I be thinking about here? Should I be thinking about neural nets? Should I be thinking about humans? Should I be thinking about rats?
Humans are definitely going to give us the like easiest to think about examples here, but I expect the same general principle applies to rats and to neural nets.
Okay.
So, for instance, if I'm a human, one like simple heuristic that I use for solving lots of problems in my life is just go make a bunch of money and then use that money to acquire whatever other shit I need, right?
Yep.
Very simple heuristic, works well in this environment, works for lots of different problems in this environment, but in some other environment probably wouldn't work as well. Like if I go somewhere where uh, Earth money isn't particularly accepted, suddenly that heuristic sucks.
Right. Okay. So money is convergently instrumental.
Yes.
And so is notably that's a sub goal. That's like a thing that's not a way of parsing the problem. In
Correct.
the example of this, your maze, it's not like you have the sub goal of get through the gap in the wall.
That is actually one way of framing this. Is this getting through this gap is an instrumentally convergent sub goal of a whole bunch of different problems. Not necessarily the ones where you're like on one side, but for all the ones where you're starting on one side and trying to get to the other, instrumentally convergent sub goals to go through that gap.
Okay.
Now this, one thing that's different between this and the money example at first glance is that this looks clearly like a factorization of the problem to like two parts.
Yeah.
If you think about the money for example for a moment, that is actually doing the same thing. Sort of the point of it is that I can go worry about how to make a bunch of money separately from worrying about what I'm going to spend that money on. I can factor the problem into those two pieces, and they mostly decouple.
Okay.
Let's try another example. Let's think about I'm going to take some sort of trip. Could be like I'm planning a road trip down to LA, done that before, or it could be something simpler like just my daily commute, right? And I'm like, all right, how am I going to get from point A to point B? And a common way of factoring that problem is to be like, all right, well, I'm going to cross most of that distance by taking the highway. Like there's, for instance, if I'm going from here to LA, can go down 5. Is that 5? The big one. Take that road all the way down Central Valley.
Okay.
And then on either end, I have to worry about the details of like, all right, how am I going to get to the highway? And then how am I going to get from the highway to wherever I'm going? Let's say Disneyland. That's a good endpoint. So I have to worry about how am I going to get from my apartment in Oakland to I-5. Then on the other end of I-5, I have to worry about how am I going to get from I-5 to Disneyland.
Yeah.
Those two problems like factor apart, right? And that's, again, environment specific. Factoring the problem this way is not going to work if I'm driving from New York to Florida. But, because like that's East Coast environment, different environment. But for a whole bunch of different goals that are in the same environment, like a whole bunch of different starting points around NorCal, a whole bunch of different starting points around SoCal, or ending points around SoCal, I can use roughly that same problem factorization.
Okay.
So again, pattern to bear in mind here is environment specific, goal general.
Yeah. And is there some broader claim that this is how agents solve problems in general, or this is a dynamic that occurs sometimes?
The claim is not quite, or not yet quite. This is how agents solve problems in general, but rather that this is how structure that problems in our world naturally have. So it's not so much a property of agents just yet as a property of like the world and like the sorts of problems that show up in the world.
Okay.
In particular, we can see it as being downstream of some of the things we were talking about earlier, much earlier. So this thing where like when we were talking about chaos, right? We were saying there's conserved quantities, everything else gets wiped out by chaos. On top of that, if we add on top of that the hypothesis that like there tend to be relatively few conserved quantities, like most stuff gets wiped out by chaos, then you sort of naturally end up with a picture of a world where it sort of naturally breaks up into a lot of different parts with relatively sparse interactions. Does that make sense?
Naturally breaks up into a lot of different parts with relatively sparse interactions. Like these two parts of this maze.
Bingo. Or like if I'm looking around this room and I'm like thinking about stuff in this room, predictions about stuff in this room, trying to plan about like moving stuff around in this room, I mostly don't need to worry about most of the stuff going on in the rest of the world. The vast majority of the stuff going on in the rest of the world isn't all that relevant. Maybe there's a few specific things I have to worry about, like cost of new furniture, or is it raining outside, or something like that. But it's a relatively like low-dimensional summary of stuff from like the broader world that's going to be relevant here.
It seems like this is mostly a feature of there being something like high bandwidth channels, or like one example you gave was using a highway. Another example is this gap in a maze. Both of these are like either there's the only way to get from A to B, or like a major way that like the highway,
sort of preferred way that's carrying things easily.
Like it's not so much that like there's actually many ways to get from here to LA.
Correct.
An infinite number of ways depending like how fine grained you want to get.
Yep.
But there's sort of there's an intermediate that is sort of privileged as the natural way to do it or the best way to do it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the relevant feature of the environment. Also notably, it's a man-made feature.
In the particular case of the highway, I think that's an unusual aspect that's actually pretty misleading. In most cases, I think that would be not the case.
Well, okay, so another example is like someone wants to be married, and they're like, they do dating to find a person, and then they are like build a relationship with a person, and that factorizes the problem into two sub-problems.
The problem of like
starting a family.
So factoring the problem of starting a family into like dating and finding a person, and then separately like building a relationship with the person.
Yeah.
Is that the factorization?
Yeah.
All right, that makes sense.
Yeah, I guess that seems like a way to carve things up. Is that importantly doing work?
Yeah, so in that case, the work would be done by like, insofar as you're able to like go date people without having to think about a lot of the details of building a relationship.
Yeah.
And then later you're able to build a relationship without having to think about a lot of the details of having to date people.
Which doesn't seem super obviously. I mean, maybe the second one seems more true than the first one, but they don't.
There's a non-trivial amount of coupling there, but like certainly they certainly decouple to a reasonably large extent.
Okay, but sometimes you can break down problems into sub-problems where you don't need to think about later stages.
Yep. Or at least you can only think about later stages as sort of some like very high-level properties of the later stages.
Yeah, so this seems true of programming. It seems true of games.
Mm-hmm.
Like you're playing 2048, you're like maneuvering the blocks to be in the right position, and there's some sort of high-level rules you might be following about how to not fuck yourself over later, but you're focusing on some local sub-goal.
Yep.
And you can abstract out all the detail of the later stages.
Mm-hmm.
So I might just say that you have super goals and sub goals.
Mm-hmm.
Does that capture what is important here, or?
Super goals and sub goals. So careful about the usage of super goal and sub goal, because like sub goals are going to have sub goals for which they are the super goals.
Right.
Yeah.
But
that's like getting at the core idea. Yeah.
You can factor a problem into sub problems,
Mm-hmm.
and then do that recursively.
Yes.
And then there's some base case where there are problems that are small enough to solve trivially.
Yep.
And that is how problem solving works.
Yep. The main thing that I guess I want to draw attention to here is this isn't just like how well this works or how well this can work is not primarily a property of the agent, it's primarily a property of the problem. Like you could imagine problems that don't factor this way. Standard example would be solving, like inverting cryptographic hash functions.
Yeah.
If your goal is to like mine Bitcoin, like as an algorithmic problem, that's a problem which does not factor well.
Right.
Which is exactly its value, right? It's hard because it doesn't factor well. But
Or like mapping genotypes to phenotypes there are some places where there are individual genes that have specific effects, but mostly it's massively polygenic. Excuse me.
I think that's.
It's not literally true.
I definitely disagree with that. So there's a problem here of the catchphrase I use is you don't get to choose the ontology.
Yeah.
So like the problem domain, like this maze, for instance, has some natural structure to it.
Yeah.
And like you can go and discover something like this guy in it and then use that. What you can't do is come along and just like draw some random line through the maze and expect to use it like this guy.
Yep.
Right? I think in most of the cases where people are saying, well, the properties of the organism are massively polymorphic, what they're doing is this. They're picking some property that's like not actually that natural a way to like break up the organism, saying, well, gee, none of the genes do this. It's just like a mix of stuff.
Yeah, right. You can build a computer out of very small computer parts and know how each part works.
Yep.
You can't build an organism out of small organism parts, but that's not necessarily because it's like fundamentally more complicated.
Right. Exactly.
You just don't understand how some of the parts work.
Exactly.
Okay. So there's it's sort of hard to know whether or not a given domain has affordances of this sort. Cryptographic hashes are
probably don't.
Yeah, that's sort of an exception in
not even.
I don't know.
It's not even really an exception. We notably do not have proofs that they don't have this sort of thing. We have sort of empirical evidence in the sense that there's been strong incentives to break them for a long time and nobody's done it.
Yeah.
But we don't have mathematical proofs that you can't like factor SHA-256 inversion into something nice like that.
Okay.
So yeah, it's hard to know for problems until like it's easy to know once you have the factorization that yep, we got one. But when you don't have one, it's hard to know whether it's because the system is like inherently doesn't have one or something else.
So I'm not sure how much this is about human working memory limitations. It seems like this is how you solve problems, basically. But that seems like it's in some sense because we have a limited context window. And if you could load, like if you can load a whole problem up, you don't necessarily need to find affordances that break it down into smaller problems at some larger scale.
Yep. If that were the case, then what we would expect to see is humans using external cognitive aids in ways that like let them handle bigger problems. And when they're doing that, they don't break up problems as much. They don't rely as much on breaking up problems. Is that what we see?
Use external cognitive aids like books? I mean...
Like books, notebooks, computers, whatever. Whatever you're using to like help solve your cognitive problem.
I think so it's not out of the question that you like a person goes into a room and they make like a giant graph on a whiteboard and like have to yarn between the pictures and they're sort of like
have that crazy look.
Yeah. And they're basically working hard to just like load everything up in not even working memory but short-term memory so that their system one can have a flash of insight.
I definitely have days like this.
That is not, at least not obviously, finding affordances that break things, like break the problem into smaller factorizable subsections.
Yep.
Or smaller factor subsections. Although, who's to say what is happening underneath that is leading to the flash of insight? But yeah, I don't know. It seems like whenever, if you can, it's easier to break things into smaller subproblems.
Certainly, yeah. Let's try a sort of sketchy, hand-wavy argument that, like, problems that don't factor neatly are going to be inherently difficult in some sense.
Okay.
So, in the context of the chaos thing earlier, we were talking about how if, like, in a system where, like, everything is very coupled to everything else, or like a chaotic system, where, like, even very low order bits are coupled to your predictions of the high order bits.
Yep.
You sort of need to have good information about everything in order to make decent predictions, because otherwise the noise in the things you don't know about just wipes out whatever signal you have about the thing you're predicting. Conceptually similar thing here. If you have a problem that sort of inherently can't break up into pieces, then in some sense you sort of need to be able to do everything all at once. You need to sort of have every single piece of information, because if you have even one piece missing, then it sort of wipes out your signal, right? So if you think about, for instance, you're trying to invert SHA-256.
Yeah.
Part of what makes that hard is you sort of have to be dealing with the entire state space at once, right? And that's an exponentially large state space.
Yeah.
Right? You've got, like, this circuit has width of, I assume, like 256 bits or something like that, which means you've got a state space of, like, 2 to the 256 at any given point in your search process, right? You sort of have to be tracking all that at once if you're not breaking it apart.
Yeah.
So,
Okay.
sort of sketchy, hand-wavy argument would be something like, well, insofar as you can't break a problem apart, you're going to have to sort of deal with everything at once, and that's going to have exponentially large resource requirements.
Yeah. Okay. And so, problem solving is mostly a matter of problem solving involves factorizing the problem.
Yeah. Insofar as the problem is solvable at all. Notes. Okay, let's tie this into some of the stuff we were talking about. So claim is that some combination of, like, the world itself for, like, prediction purposes, or problems that naturally arise in the world for problem solving purposes, insofar as they're solvable at all, have this, like, tend to have sort of natural factorization structure built into them. So then the next claim is going to be that those, like, natural factors end up naturally mapping to stuff inside of a mind. Why would that happen? So, a very toy model. Suppose we're starting in a picture like this.
Okay.
Where either there's just not much information flowing at all, or there's a bunch of information flowing, it's all sort of wiped out as noise, whatever. That's like the initial state of the mind in question. Now, in order for information channels to start to develop in this mind at all, what has to happen is you need, like, some correlation between, like, the thing over here and a thing somewhere else. Maybe, like, two inputs are correlated. Maybe, like, my two eyes are seeing correlated things, or maybe, like, there's some correlation between, like, what's coming into my senses and what things get rewarded when I move my arm around. Some sort of thing that sort of involves a correlation on a larger scale. And then whatever.
For what?
Hold on.
Okay.
Then our selection mechanism, this external correlations, external long-range correlation, in combination with our selection mechanism, whatever that is, so SGD, thin lifetime learning, what have you, is going to then be applying selection pressure for some sort of information channel to form. The key idea here is, like, insofar as, like, thing over here and thing over there is independent, there should not be selection pressure for some sort of information channel to form, and therefore you should, by default, not get an information channel.
Okay, so just to summarize, there's like some underlying assumption here, which is like a mind is predicting reality.
Yeah, so in this case, we're talking about prediction. Same thing should generalize to problem solving, but prediction for now.
And so like insofar as you're like the job of this mind is to do prediction. If there are, the way it does that is it notices and abstracts out correlations between representations inside the system. When this neuron is active and this neuron is active at the same time, that is a correlation. Because both those neurons are representing something in the outer world, if they're active at the same time, that is suggestive, if everything's working right, of a correlation in the outer world, which you want to be represented somehow.
Yep.
That representing that correlation is what it means to learn, and is what allows you to, it's what it means to learn.
Yeah, roughly the right idea. You're bringing in like a fair bit of higher level of interpretation that like I would not necessarily assign to this thing just yet.
Okay.
But like if we like bring it slightly down to a more mechanistic level, we're saying something like selection mechanism is going to be sort of making things more correlated internally in response to external correlations. And therefore, the things that are inducing like long-range correlations externally, conserved quantities, for instance, are going to naturally end up mapping to things that are like information channels internally. And then the part where you were going a little higher level than that was then going on to say, all right, that should probably mean that this is like a representation of what's going on out there.
And that's not necessarily the case?
There's more than one level of thing that we can call representation. Like we saw the first such thing earlier talking about bacteria. This is like the second such thing. There's going to be another one later.
Okay.
But like this is another level of thing that we could call representation.
Okay.
But the important, like the more mechanistic thing to say is just that like there's an informational signal passing in here, which is like selected to be tightly correlated with some sort of conserved quantity in the external environment, something that's like passing over a long distance or a long time in the environment.
We're able to get it done, so it's all good.
Okay.
That part makes sense?
I think so.
Cool. Back to my notes. This. I'm trying to decide which part I want to do next. Hang on. I think I'm gonna jump to general purpose search for this one. So we've now got a notion of like these information channels being induced that map to like long-range correlations in the environment. We could tell a conceptually similar story about like factorization type stuff for problems that are recurring in the environment. That like selection pressure ends up doing a conceptually similar thing. We have a story about modules, and we have a story about reuse of modules.
Yep.
The main thing that we don't have in this picture yet is anything about reuse. Right? This is just sort of drawn as sort of a hard-coded information channel here.
Okay.
So now we get to the sort of grand coming together of all this stuff.
Okay, actually, I do want to back up here.
Yeah.
There's selection for this information channel because why? There's two things that are correlated in the environment.
Yep. So for
and we're just like the SDG.
the simplest case to see is there's some sort of like stuff coming into my sensory inputs.
Yeah.
And the thing that's correlated with that is what's like the highest reward action to take with my arm. and therefore the selection pressure will be to like pass information from my sensory inputs to whatever thing is actuating my arm, because I want to, because like there's incentive to do different things.
So if you see an apple hanging up on a tree, see a ripe apple.
Yep.
There's a channel from the see an apple detectors in the visual cortex to the motor cortex that says do this.
Yes.
Now for humans that's a lot more complicated, but maybe
Definitely an oversimplified story. Yeah.
Yeah, but for a simpler organism, maybe it's basically like that. Like E. coli is swimming, E. coli builds up a swim if the gradients are, the densities are increasing.
Yep.
And flail around if the gradients are decreasing.
Yep. Note that there it's happening at evolutionary time, not within lifetime. But yeah.
Yeah, right. Right, but you could learn some behavior pattern.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And then there's some outer loop that is optimizing for that, is reinforcing that.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
All right. So now let's start to bring some of this like reuse of modules back into here.
Yeah.
So if I'm an agent that's like wandering around a particular environment, I'm facing a lot of different problems in that environment, or at least a lot of different sub-problems in that environment, as I'm going about life. I'm going to want to reuse a lot of heuristics, a lot of pieces of information from that environment intuitively, right? So like if I'm an agent in this environment, this maze, and I'm like, I've discovered this useful factorization.
Yeah.
I'm going to want to like reuse that for a lot of different problems, right?
Other problems meaning like if you are living in this maze and trying to get from different points, like the maze is constant, but where you're trying to go from and where you're trying to get changes.
Yes, exactly.
Okay. And then you save the factorization.
Yes, so you'll be incentivized to reuse that factorization because that again allows for compression, right? You need fewer. You need to memorize sort of fewer special case heuristics. If you can reuse this general purpose one a lot, that gets you compression. Compression is selected form.
Yeah.
So we expect to see some sort of reuse through something like that. Similarly, at the level, so that was an example like that for a heuristic. Similarly, for information. If you have information that's relevant in a lot of different places, like conserved quantities, those things that are spread out over space or spread out over time, then as far as you can like reuse that and for problem solving in all those different places, you'll expect to have some sort of module that's like keeping track of that information and can be used again and again.
What's an example of a conserved quantity that can be used again and again?
Think of an intuitive one here. So something like object permanence. Object permanence is a classic example of this. Like here's this marker, hide it behind your back, and the baby's like, it's gone. You're back. It's back. Right? Like, yeah. It's once we get a little older, we realize, okay, it's being conserved even though I don't see it.
Okay, and there's a module that's doing that?
It's little more complicated than that.
Okay.
I wouldn't quite word it as like there's a module that's doing that. Let's jump right to that part. There is, so we've got all these like sort of things that are somehow being encoded for reuse, right? All this like information about, oh, there's a marker somewhere, even though I don't see it right now, or there's like this heuristic that we figured out for this maze, and that's all encoded in this mind somewhere in a way that like is suitable for reuse. We haven't yet made it clear how exactly that's happening, right?
Okay.
A useful thing we can use to sort of narrow down how that might be encoded, or how it might be used, is consistency pressure. Similar to like what we had in cells when we were talking about like consistent trade-offs between things. Similar thing is going to happen here. We want consistent. How do I word this? Consistent, approximately globally consistent probabilities, and consistent, read it. Implicit, approximately globally consistent probabilities, and implicit, approximately globally consistent trade-off ratios. So, like, insofar as I'm facing lots of different problems in the world, and I can, like, make trade-offs in ways that use resources in different ways, or, like, make trade-offs that sort of imply different beliefs about, like, partially uncertain information in my environment.
Yeah.
I want to be making those in consistent ways, because otherwise I could get a Pareto improvement. Right?
Yeah.
So there's a consistency pressure in there to, like, insofar as I'm breaking up the world and representing different parts of the world using all these different pieces of information or different heuristics or, like, different conserved quantities, I want to make sure those are all consistent with each other. Like, if I'm using this heuristic in one place and a different heuristic in another place, I want to make sure that that I'm using those in a consistent way, such that there's not like some Pareto improvement I could get by like changing how I'm using them jointly.
I mean, I'm not sure how much actual minds are on the Proto frontier in the heuristic, like, kind of a mess. Humans are kind of a mess.
Yep.
Squirrels, might be worse.
Let's talk about what something like very far from the Proto frontier would look like. In the context of this maze, for instance.
Yep.
So let's say there's an agent which is, doing maze solving, getting from point A to point B in this maze. Sometimes it uses this heuristic, and sometimes it uses another one here. That one.
Yep.
So this agent, let's say, is just starting out in that corner. And it says, all right, I want to get, let's have it actually use this guy. I want to get over here. And I'm starting with the orange heuristic, using that one, so I'm going to try to get over here.
Yep.
So it's like generally exploring around, trying to get closer to that hole right there. And then at some point it's like, I'm going to try that other heuristic for a while. And it's like, all right, I need to get over there. And then maybe it decides to go back this way, because that seems like a shorter way to get to here, right?
Okay.
That would be kind of dumb.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I had months like that.
Yeah. that's what inconsistency looks like. If like you're switching from at one point you're using one heuristic, at one point you're using another heuristic, and when you switch back and forth between these, your joint behavior is something that's just like kind of dumb.
Yeah. That makes sense. I think, in fact, humans do that a lot.
Yep.
Especially when what heuristic they're using to guide their behavior is guided by some kind of saliency, like whatever they were reminded of more recently.
Yep. I definitely think that's true at some scales. On the other hand, I think like once you see it like that, it also becomes clear just like to what a large extent we're not doing this.
Yeah, I don't usually have trouble getting the serial.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You don't usually have trouble with like your left and right arm are trying to do totally different things. You don't usually get caught walking back and forth between halfway to the fridge and then halfway to the sink and then halfway to your bed in a loop 12 times in a row.
Yeah.
Yeah. Whereas if you watch, say, shitty game playing bots, they totally do that.
Yeah.
I was watching some StarCraft bots last night, and like there's like this building that it like takes off into the air, then steps down again, then takes off again, then steps down again, over and over again. The bot just like did this for several minutes.
Okay.
Humans don't do that, right? That's consistency pressure.
Yeah. Okay. Alright, so object permanence, consistency pressure, these are examples of consistency pressure is like a pressure on an agent.
Mm-hmm.
A property that agents there's a incentive for the agents to have this property.
Yep.
How does this relate to the other things?
So, insofar as we're getting some sort of internal information carriers,
Yeah.
consistency pressure is going to act on those wherever they're represented. Insofar as we are reusing modules, consistency pressure is going to act across the instances in which they're reused. So, for instance, let's say I have, fuck it, we're going to do general purpose search. Let's say relatively early on in like the mind development process, whether evolutionary or within lifetime, I get like a bunch of a few different specialized modules for like solving particular problems. So think like SpexWasp, when it's time for it to go lay eggs or whatever it is, it has like this very specific behavior that gets activated and just like follows this hard-coded behavioral pattern and then goes off to do something else.
Yeah.
Let's say one of those modules ends up being called in like a sort of wider and wider range of circumstances. So like evolutionarily, it's being originally it's just like this one behavior, and then it gets sort of adapted to also be used for a different behavior, and then gets further adapted to also be used for different behavior. And like as this is going on, it's like under pressure to become more and more general purpose, right?
Okay.
Insofar as like that's a thing that can happen, that's something that's going to allow a lot of compression, because you can have this one relatively general purpose module that's solving a lot of different problems and a lot of different circumstances. Right?
Yep. Okay. So you have a simple reflex agent, and its policy is generalized to something more flexible and more conditional.
It gradually gets more general, policy gets more compressible, until you end up with something that looks like general purpose search. And then the question is, all right, what exactly is this general purpose search thing? What is it going to look like? And key insight here is planning or search has a sort of recursive structure to it.
Yep.
So for instance, in the maze problem, we're like, okay, my problem is to get from here to here. I'm going to like break this thing up into subproblems, then recursively do search from here to there.
Yep.
So if I have a module that's like a general purpose search module, one of the main things this search module is going to be doing, maybe the main thing it's going to be doing, is calling some of our environment-specific heuristics about how to break things up, and then recursively calling the general purpose search module again on like the subproblems that it's broken up into.
Yep.
Make sense?
Yeah.
So this is sort of the...
It is a bit. I mean, I imagine that human minds are way more of a mess than this. Like when I'm writing some software, I would write a search function and like recursively call it, and I'm not sure how that is the thing that makes sense to do. That's clean and correct.
Yep.
I'm not sure what actually happens like how much involved minds are doing a similar thing.
Yep. So definitely one thing I noticed that diverges from this idealized picture is like if I'm working on a problem, I do break it up into subproblems, right, whenever I can.
Yeah.
And then I'll go just sort of work on one of the subproblems and forget about everything else for a while.
Yep.
And then at some point I might pop back up and be like, well, shit, what were all those other problems?
Yeah.
Or I'll like go work on a subproblem and sort of lose track of the context and end up doing the wrong thing on the subproblem because I didn't remember why I was doing it in the first place.
Yep.
That's another way in which this is ideal. On the other hand, these are both failure modes that sort of naturally emphasize that like this is the thing we're approximating, right? Like these are failure modes that are clearly like
Yeah.
sort of natural failure modes of something that's approximating this story about general purpose search and recursive factorization problems.
Yeah. Although those are pretty. You thinking about something is pretty cognitive.
Yep.
And pretty influenced by your thinking about how one would approach a problem like this.
Certainly, yeah.
There's also questions of like when a bee is looking for pollen, what sort of cognition is happening.
Yep.
And it wouldn't surprise me if this kind of thing is happening. It wouldn't surprise me, but like one thing that wouldn't surprise me is if there's an embarrassing amount of redundancy where there's like the general there's like in fact the search for pollen or like there's the search evolved for food and there's the search evolved for sex. And they're just both there.
Now there is remember our compression argument from earlier does give us some reason to expect that that something more general will be favored.
Yeah. Favored definitely,
But
I don't know how tightly.
How like quantitatively favored.
Yeah, like we have there's arguments about what is the optimal setup for things, and then there's like a sort of like an analogous question: how efficient is the market of like are the fitness constraints and competition such that the actual evolved organisms and actual evolved minds are queuing very close to the theoretical optimum?
Yep.
Or are they just fucking around most of the time?
Yeah.
And I think, I imagine it depends on different things.
Probably, yeah.
On the one hand, cognitive system 2 tasks are more recent, and so probably like less optimal in some important sense. On the other hand, they're more reflective, so they can incorporate abstract ideas about how to do things, such that actually I expect there to be more diff between how you solve a cognitive problem and how most humans solve a cognitive problem.
Yeah, that sounds right.
Where I don't think there's very much diff between how you solve a motor problem and how most humans solve a motor problem.
Yep, that sounds right.
And probably, the solutions that organisms are using for...
You might be surprised. I've been known to dance on occasion.
Yeah, but
still.
using the same algorithms.
Yeah.
But okay, so search. You're like, the search is the natural generalization of some problem solving.
Yeah, so search is...
you start with simple reflex, sort of like this thing is connected with this thing.
As things get more general, because the problem space has this structure of, or insofar as they're solvable at all, has this structure where like you can break stuff into subproblems and then recursively search on those subproblems. And there will be selection pressure for generalizable problem-solving methods, or general purpose search. Sort of natural thing to expect it to end up at is this structure of like breaking into subproblems then recursively calling search.
Yeah, I'm not sure if there's another... That seems intuitive. I'm not sure if there's another relatively general thing to do.
It's also something I wonder about. Yeah.
Like if I just had a really sophisticated list of if-then statements.
Compression is an issue.
Yeah. Like, I don't think LLMs are doing search, but I think you would say, but LLMs, there's selection pressure on them to be doing search, basically, because
that sounds right.
There's selection pressure to compress all of the, like, trillions of heuristics into more general things.
Yes.
Okay.
Another thing I'd highlight while you're thinking of like, how humans or animals diverge from the ideal here is a key step here is like figuring out how to factor the problem, right? And our hypothesis is like, again, environment specific, goal general, So like there's going to be a lot of heuristics or like information concepts that you learn somehow and then reuse again and again. But the learning is still sort of, how does that happen? Probably expensive, not quite sure, right? In the case of humans, maybe like you're learning it by like being passed linguistically from other humans. Maybe there's some sort of selection process like along these lines where like just doing some sort of learning process real hard on a lot of data sort of burns in that pathway. Yeah, more than one way that could happen, but like the sort of practical thing to expect there is that insofar as the environment is changing or the agent is entering new environments, they're going to be bad at factoring problems initially. And I think that is a thing we see in humans, is we are in fact not actually that good at factoring problems. Just because the problem can be factored doesn't mean we know how to factor it well.
Okay, but we can reuse.
Once we see it, we can reuse it.
And okay, so what? Fluid intelligence is search, and crystallized intelligence is cached factorizations.
I mean, surely there's no way in hell that that's not an oversimplification, right? But also, kind of, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Okay.
Let me check my notes.
Should I? Yeah.
You're
maybe.
Welcome to ask more questions, Bob.
Well, maybe one of us should summarize. The upshot here is like, yeah, minds are sufficiently compressed minds are searchy things. Searching is a matter of factorizing a problem and then recursively factorizing a problem.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what a mind does, you claim.
Sort of the core loop. Not the only thing a mind does, but it's the core, like, problem solving.
I mean, I don't know how most organisms are not very general.
Yep.
I don't
Well-
know if I would say
Sort of. Go on.
like maybe I'll be surprised by how smart bumblebees are.
Yeah, I would not expect bumblebees to be particularly general.
Like I think they're mostly a bunch of reflexes.
Rats, though. Rats are surprisingly smart. So my guess would be that you'd see. My guess is that like rats basically have this machinery.
Yeah.
Bumblebees basically don't. Not that I've studied either of those enough to have like a very strong opinion on it, but that would be my guess.
Yeah. Okay. And also there's I guess this is your drawing earlier. There's a continuum between simple reflexes, which are like fragile, memorized policies.
Yep.
And general, flexible, compressed policies.
Yep.
And the general ones have something in common, which is that they are searchy.
Yeah. That's the hypothesis.
Yeah, my guess is even if all of the general ones are searchy in some sense, there's a lot of variation in actual cognitive algorithms that break down problems and recursively solve them.
That is like the place where you'd expect to see a lot of variation is definitely in like how do you break down the problems.
I mean, also if your base case, like if the base case for what you do at the lowest level is different,
Yep.
like for a human having more visual ability than verbal ability.
Yep.
That would inform the reinforcement learning at every level of the stack of how, like, what affordances to break things down into.
Yep.
And then you end up with two algorithms that are, like, at some high level abstraction the same, but also really quite different in their implementation details.
Yeah,
like
pretty plausible.
watching one way, yeah, like I don't know, you're trying to solve a maze, and or like what's an example where you might be colorblind? You're trying to like, I don't know, you have Alpha Zero, and you have a version of Alpha Zero that has like a bigger Monte Carlo tree search versus a bigger value network.
Yep.
Like, I don't know if you end up with like different personalities in play based on the different strengths that you have. If you can just do more, like play out the game trees more, versus you have better intuitions about which ones are good. Probably there's some optimal balance.
Yep.
In either, if you play them long enough, they'll converge to something that looks.
My main expectation in that case is once you reach a certain like reasonable depth of tree search and reasonable scale of value network, you're gonna get pretty strong convergence. So like there'll be some corner cases where like the one that can look an extra step ahead does better, or like the one with the slightly larger network manages to just barely guess the right thing rather than the wrong thing.
Yeah.
My guess is at that point, in the vast majority of cases, they're going to be saying basically the same thing.
I don't know how sensitive Go is to small perturbations. Is Alpha Zero fully deterministic? If you play the same move, does it? If you give it put it in the same situation, does it suggest the same move every time?
I don't know that.
If not, then I don't know. Then there's more room for there to be personality. I expect that they're efficient. Like humans couldn't tell the difference between them.
For sure, yeah.
But yeah, okay. All right. Things are fundamentally searchy. Yeah, so there does seem to be some kind of magic step between you are building Havian relationships between neurons in a bumblebee brain.
Yep.
And you do that a bunch and compress it down, and then you develop Surge.
Correct.
In fact, I'm not even sure that you can just compress away a bunch of. Seems like maybe you need some special. You need to like specifically involve a searchy thing.
So I think the part I know of that we glossed over that would best fit the thing you're gesturing at.
Yeah.
Is the difference between like evolving a hard-coded circuit versus something that is even capable of recursively calling itself at all.
Yeah.
That's a significant non-trivial step.
Yeah. And you... Okay. That has more detail, or just...
I wasn't intending to like unpack that one particularly, but like follows similar story to the stories we were telling earlier about using bits of memory, and the big change there is like you're going to have something calling itself. You'll need to be using feedback. You'll need to be using memory, that sort of thing.
Yeah. Okay. Is this your summary, or is this like you're like this is what a mind is?
We do have like another few pieces, but this was definitely the like summit of the thing.
Yeah. Okay. What are the other pieces?
So I believe the next bit is talking about representation again. Yeah, so next there's representation again, and then language. So we talked about representation in like the context of the E. coli, where we had this signal that was like tracking something in the environment.
Yep.
This is very similar to that. This picture here, where like there's some information channel that's sort of getting burned in by a bunch of data, so that now it tracks a particular thing in the environment. Once we have a general purpose search module, then we've got a somewhat different notion of representation, because the search module is going to be like querying a particular piece of information in specific situations. And then there's a notion of semantics that's something like, well, such and such problem came up and I need like the piece of information that tells me about this thing. So I'm sort of going to be interpreting it as that thing. Does that make sense?
I need the piece of information. there's some representational system.
Yeah, let me do a concrete example. Hang on. Let's say I put up a screen, right? Put up this screen,
Okay.
and I roll a die behind it. You don't know the value of the die.
Yeah.
But then, like, I record the die in an Excel spreadsheet on that computer.
Okay.
And now I'm like, Eli, I want you to figure out the value of this die. And also, I just, like, moved it around a bit, so it's no longer on the die back here.
Okay.
So you go look at the value in the Excel spreadsheet, and you're like, this value in the Excel spreadsheet, that's probably the value of that die.
Yep.
Now, somewhere in there was this step where you were like, there's going to be this thing on that computer over there I'm going to look at, and that's going to tell me the value of this other thing out in the environment.
Yep.
Right? Now think of that whole process happening like inside a brain. Like the planning process part of it is there's something out in the environment that you need to know about. In this case, like what the value of that die was.
Yep.
And you know that there's like some spot in the brain where you can go look to find some information that tells you about what that thing out in the environment was.
Because it has it memorized. Because
there's some sort of indexing in like the mind that lets you say like, here's the thing I need to know about. What's its value? And then crucially, the like
so that might be of the form where I want to go buy some kale. I'm like, where is Sprouts?
Mm-hmm.
And I have memorized like it's over that way.
Yep.
Or wait, no, Whole Foods is over that way. Whatever.
There's also a Sprouts if you go far enough. It's a ways.
Well, anyways, that was not the information that I was intending to store. And a different thing might be, someone's like, "Hey, do you know if are Oliver and Megan still dating?" And I'm like, go query some part of my brain that's like, well, last I saw them together, they were like talking. I heard that Megan was pregnant, and I'm like doing some computations, and then I'm like, I don't know.
So are Oliver and Megan still dating?
I don't know.
I didn't know there was someone named Megan that Oliver was dating in the first place.
Oliver, they dated like 10 years ago.
Oh, okay.
This is Scott Siskin's wife now.
Okay, cool.
I
Right,
don't know if
way
this
off
is
track now. Yeah. Thing I want to emphasize that may make it clearer, like, what this new notion of representation is and why it's different. With our previous two notions of representation, there wasn't really a way that the system's representation could be wrong. Like if the E. coli has this sort of internal signal that's tracking this stuff out in the environment, either it like does generally track the stuff out in the environment, in which case it's sort of by definition representing the thing.
Yeah.
Or it just like doesn't particularly well track the thing in the environment, in which case sort of by definition not representing the thing. And like you could sometimes maybe get around that a bit by like having some corner cases where like it's usually representing the thing, but then like sometimes it's wrong. But for the most part, it's hard to say there that like you can have a representation of the thing that's wrong about it. Whereas here, with this example, you can totally be wrong about it. The general purpose search can be like, I want to know where the Whole Foods is. Give me that information. Go pull that out of your brain, and your brain could just be totally wrong about that. Your like cached value of where's the Whole Foods could not at all match where the Whole Foods actually is.
Yeah.
So there's this, what's defining representation here is no longer centrally about whether the things actually match.
Yeah, okay.
It's instead more about like how this information is being indexed.
Yeah.
When you're going to go access it and what you're going to
I can be mistaken.
Yep.
I can have a mistaken representation, which means your definition of representation can't be mapping correctly to
Exactly.
the external world.
Exactly.
Okay.
This is something that like philosophers talking about semantics get like really hooked on.
Yeah.
And like it's pretty complicated because like you need pretty complicated machinery like this before you can even start to talk about like what's a representation that can be wrong. Yeah.
Okay. I feel like we did just gloss over, like, that was a pretty, how representation works, like, how the indexing process works. I am not, like, I now know the gears of that. I'm like, yeah, that's...
Yeah,
seems...
we're glossing that because I don't understand it.
Yeah, okay.
Like, that's definitely a big spot where my map of this stuff has a lot of uncertainty in it.
Yeah.
Yeah. We, what else? One note here is this whole thing about like indexing and representations. Again, reuse is like playing a pretty big role here. So we had this sort of specific story about how general purpose search works, factoring problems, that sort of thing. But even if we set aside that specific picture, if we want to talk about representation in this new sense, even in the absence of a general purpose search algorithm, we probably need to have at least some kind of reuse involved in it. So like we need to have some sort of thing that we can interpret as like it's querying where the Whole Foods is, and like somehow we're interpreting its query as meaning, hey, where's the Whole Foods, right?
Why does that have reuse in it?
Because like we're assigning semantics to the query as opposed to the like result, and if you're not like reusing the same query or reusing the same system that generates the query multiple times, then how do we assign meaning to the query, right?
I'm not sure I follow that.
It's not super central anyway. So.
Okay.
If you want to double click on it, we can. But
I think that it's fine.
all right, cool. Then let's jump to language. So we have still a fair bit of uncertainty about the gears of this representation thing, but at this point we have this notion of like representation of these sort of internal things that map to stuff in the natural things in the environment. Once we get to language, the next question is going to be, all right, are two different agents going to have two of these internal things that are like isomorphic to each other so we can attach a word to them and communicate?
Okay.
So backing up a step, example of the sort of problem here, like why this is interesting and difficult. If you think about the number of functions that take in a megapixel image and spit out a yes/no answer to the question, is there an apple in this image? The number of such functions is not just exponentially huge, but super exponentially huge. It's like 2 to the 2 to the million.
Okay. Why isn't it infinite? Wait, you limited the size.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
1 megapixel image, binary output, so it is not infinite. It is finite, but extremely large.
Yeah.
And even once we account for like most images or noise, there's still going to be a pretty large space of images and an extremely large space of possible functions.
Yeah.
And yet, so like if you want to brute force figure out like the apple function, right? If you want to figure that out by brute force, then the amount of data you need to do that is like ridiculously massive, like 2 to the million images or some such.
Okay.
And yet, we look at babies and how many apples they need to see and hear you like point at it and say apple before they figure out what the word apple means. And the number is like 1, 2, 3. It's extremely small, right? Like they very quickly
millions.
pick up words. It's certainly not
It's not
millions.
definitely not
Forget 2 to the million.
Yeah,
right? So, in some sense, virtually all of the like bits of evidence about what the concept is have to be coming from some sort of prior knowledge, some sort of shared way of breaking up the world into pieces that like the baby and the not baby already had before they started like passing these words back and forth.
Yeah, okay.
It can't be coming from brute force.
I mean, yeah, we both start with edge detectors.
Yeah. So you're both starting with edge detectors. That's
and
one
television.
example. And the hypothesis here is, insofar as the environment is filled with these sort of natural heuristics or these natural sort of concepts to use for predictive purposes, your brains are both going to be like naturally picking up on those same things, and so those are natural things to go attach words to.
Yeah.
And then once we start, and that's sort of like how you get lowest level words, like words like apple or words like tree, right? Or like vase. We did the thing with the vases earlier, right?
Yeah.
Like, I get a bunch of information about lots of different apples by observing one apple. It's like conserved quantities here. So natural thing to go attach a word to. Then once we've got that as sort of a lowest level thing to build on, then we get to combinatorial language, building more complex sentences and concepts out of multiple words. And that's how you can start to communicate things for which you don't already have a built-in concept. Like I could say something analogous to, hey, try using this heuristic, right? And I could if they have concept for that part and a concept for that part, then I can sort of build that up out of those parts. That all make sense?
Yes. This is easy, or it's the case that you and I and the baby all have edge detectors and color vision.
Mm-hmm.
Once we start talking about abstract conceptual things, we don't have the same parsing machinery necessarily.
Yep.
In fact, I think we mostly don't, since we needed to grow it from scratch given the problems we were solving and our cognitive profiles when we were solving those problems.
Yep.
And then the pairing words to percepts kind of breaks down.
So this depends heavily on extent of overlap of the environment. So again, the motto is environment specific, goal neutral. Insofar as our environments are somewhat different, we're going to have different concepts to attach words to. Fun story here, at a workshop a year and a half ago, we did a little experiment with Duncan. It was like a bunch of mathematicians and Duncan.
Okay.
Right? So we decided to do this experiment to see if Duncan had already intuitively the concept of a mathematical group.
Okay.
Even though he'd never studied the math at all. And the answer was no, he definitely did not.
Okay.
It was like an hour and a half of us doing little demos with markers and stuff, trying to gesture at the concept of a group, and him trying to be like, what the heck are they talking about?
Okay.
But yeah, that's because it was a bunch of mathematicians, our environment had sort of included this concept and showed us a bunch of examples that emphasize it.
Yeah.
Whereas Duncan had not been an environment that emphasized a bunch of examples of groups.
I think you might be overestimating the extent to which it's just the environment as opposed to the features that individuals extract from the environment.
Mm-hmm.
This is not super the that you need to share the environment is the bare minimum that you need.
Mm-hmm.
There's also Eliezer and Paul have been in the same environment more or less, although Paul went to math camp when he was a child, and so believes that other smart people exist and therefore markets are efficient or something.
I think that the environments of these two are very importantly different in several ways, that being one of them.
What are the other ways?
Paul, to my knowledge, has not spent significant time outside of academia or academia adjacent labs. Eliezer has not spent significant time outside of the internet, I guess.
Yeah, the internet and Miri.
And Miri, I guess,
I don't know.
kind of an extension of the internet. Yeah.
Anyways, okay, yeah. So, there's some shared representation. There's some shared inputs. Some inputs that we have overlap on because we have the same sensory machinery.
Yep.
And we can attach labels to them.
Yeah. I would add here a sort of hand-wavy argument for why the environment would be the main driver is something like, to the extent that this environment-specific goal general motto holds, you should expect lots of different goals to converge on like needing the same heuristics or needing the same concepts within the same environment. Like instrumental convergence is like what's doing the work here.
Yeah. Okay, and that's language.
And that's language in a very small nutshell.
To language, yeah.
Yeah. High gloss, obviously, but that's like the sort of foundation of language.
Yeah.
All right. That brings us to the last piece, self-models.
Okay.
Let me get a snapshot of the board and then erase some. So I'm going to start by addressing a common point of confusion. The common point of confusion says something like, if an agent is embedded in a physical world, like, we're embedded in a physical world, and the agent is trying to model both the world and itself, that's sort of an inherently hard thing because the world is inherently bigger than the agent. Like the world contains the agent and therefore it must be bigger. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Counter argument to this is we can just totally have data structures that contain themselves. Standard one you can define in Python would look like this. Let's say the list L equals 1, 2, 3, and then we call L.append, and since Python is not particularly type safe, we can append L to this list.
Okay.
And now this is a list which contains itself. And like the reason that we can just do this is because in data structures, pointers are just totally a thing. And you can do that.
Yeah.
Right? So for purposes of self-models, the sort of core thing that you need to be able to like use is something analogous to a data structure that allows pointers to like other things in the model or other submodels. So as long as you have the ability to like create a submodel that can just have a pointer to other generic submodels, you can create a submodel that like has a pointer to itself or to something that contains itself. And then suddenly self-models are a lot less mysterious. You can just like have that data structure, that's fine.
And it points to the whole brain? Points to
your internal model of your brain.
Okay.
So like somewhere in your model, you have like this model of like Eli's brain. You have some like stuff that you know about brains in there. And when you're like, this is me, you're like, I like this brain, this model, right?
Okay.
So that's sort of the core confusion that people get stuck on. Once you get past that, things get a lot simpler. So let's do the cloud picture. So we're now going to get to the like sort of highest level thing that I would think of as a concept of agency. There's multiple levels of agency. There's like the lowest level was just taking different actions in response to different observations in such a way that like you get consistent outcomes. That one we did very early. This is going to be the last. So this last concept of agency is you've got some action. It's going to cause some outcome. But now you've also got a planning process. And what this planning process is going to do is it's got a model of how the action is going to cause the outcome.
Okay.
And it's going to use the model itself to decide which action to take. And the model knows this. So the model includes a model of itself that looks basically like this sort of structure. Like, the model contains action causing outcome, and then it's going to use that model to decide which action to take in order to achieve a particular outcome.
All right, I need an example of that. If I want to go by kale.
Yep, all right, that's your outcome, buying kale.
B, yeah. And then A is Instacart, using Instacart.
All right, you're going to use Instacart to buy some kale. And you have a model of yourself doing all this.
Which is just like my
You're currently thinking about it.
Yeah.
And then part of that model is that if you like query that model and be like, well, why would I use Instacart to buy kale?
Because I have to go somewhere.
Well, no, because it's going to get you kale.
Well, yeah.
So the main thing is, why are you using Instacart to buy kale? And you can also like zoom out a level and say, well, because my model says that if I use Instacart to get kale, then I will end up with kale. And the key distinction here between just like this picture without the cloud and this picture with like the cloud and the strange loop in it, is you're able to reason about your own reasoning process. You can do that at arbitrary levels of depth, just recurse more. In practice, you probably don't want to go more than like 1 or 2 levels. Gets a little touchy, but yeah.
Okay. My planning process. Oh, okay. Where's the loopiness? I'm like, I would like some kale. I will get Instacarts. That will get me kale.
Yep.
And there's a reference where I'm like, how do I know this will get me kale? I'm like, well, reference the planning process that I'm doing here.
Yep.
That's the thing that you mean?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I'm a little bit suspicious that doesn't seem like what's happening per se. I mean, I guess like what's happening is I'm like, well, I should get kale. The cash thing to do is to use Instacart.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes an objection comes up. I'm like, well, that'll take too long.
Yep. So clearly this would be more relevant in places where you aren't operating out of cache.
Yeah. Okay, so take a different example. I'm what's a thing? I'm trying to set up this workshop for Jeffrey.
There you go. That's a good one.
And the first problem is no one is clear what the goal is.
So you need to get clarity on what the goal is.
Yeah. As a goal, does that be?
Well, it depends. Are you about to introduce the new sub-goal of that, or are you saying that the goal is to set up the workshop? Getting clarity on the goal is to setting up the workshop.
So in practice, I'm like, all right, Jeffrey, here's the deal. You need to tell us why I can't decide this for you. You got to tell us what the point of this is.
All right. So your goal B is to get clarity on the goals of the workshop.
Yeah.
Then A is going to be go bug Jeffrey about it.
Yeah. And then all of this is happening in my imagination.
Currently, yes.
I mean, this also actually happened. So maybe I'm supposed to pick a different thing that hasn't happened yet.
So maybe an easier way to think of this, rather than as it being in your imagination, is like, imagine me from an external perspective being like, all right, what's going on in Eli's head right now?
Yeah.
Well, in Eli's head, there's this model that, like, by talking to Jeffrey, we get clarity on the goals of the workshop.
Yep.
And this sort of cloud is representing the model in Eli's head.
Yep.
And this arrow is saying, well, Eli's probably not explicitly thinking about this right now, but like if I query him, Eli will say,
oh yeah, why? Okay. Why do you think this action will lead to? Why do you think that A will lead to B? And you're like, well, that's what my model is. My model is that A leads to B.
There you go. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I'm not usually explicitly thinking about the fact that as I'm doing the planning step, that it's implicitly premised on my model of the situation.
But from an external perspective, modeling that, like I would include that to be clear that like this isn't actually my model of A causing B.
Yeah.
Like I may have entirely different beliefs about how successful your attempts to pester Jeffrey will be at gaining clarity on the goals of the workshop. That suddenly got too real. My model may be entirely different from yours there, and like the actual action you take is going to be a function of your model.
Yeah. Okay.
In fact,
Right.
we could even separately introduce to this like the actual action you take out in the environment, which will actually cause B or not cause B, and then like this part is Eli internal, And this part is like John's model of the whole outer situation and Eli.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Should I? I'm not sure what I should. Your like self models. Your planning process includes a reference, like a reference you can like a pointer you can dereference back to the planning itself.
Then the last thing I want to do here is like quickly sketch out what some hypothetical Python code for that sort of structure would look like.
Yeah.
Which will make it clear where things like decision theory come in. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to have a model, call that M. Okay. Not actually going to write this as Python, but hopefully we'll get the gist of the thing.
Okay.
So M is going to have two pieces. It's going to say, here's how you generate A, here's how you generate B. B is just going to be like some function of A. That's this arrow right here.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. A is going to be the more complicated one. It's going to say, take an argmax on some goal, expectation of utility of B, and then you're taking an expectation of something, so you need to take that expectation under a model. What model you're going to use? Well, let's, for sake of argument, say we're building a causal decision theorist here, so my model is going to be M, this model itself, dot do, so I'm doing a do operation in which I set big A equal to little a. So what I have here is like a model. This M is, pointer back out to this model itself. If I try to evaluate something in that model, like if I say, all right, model, which action do you predict will be taken in this model? Then the model will say, all right, I need to take an argmax over A of utility of B under some model. Which model? M with A done. So I'm going to cut that arrow, say I'm taking action little a here. What B do I get out of that? Let's say action little a is go talk to Jeffrey. Will that give me clarity on the goals of the workshop? Maybe. Calculate expected utility of that.
Yeah.
Compare some other action. Compare all my other actions, whatever actions are available for each of them. I'm going to say, all right, cut that arrow. Suppose I'm taking that action.
You're gonna compare all of them?
Whatever actions I'm considering in this argmax.
Okay.
So I'm going to for each of them, I'm going to check this guy, see what I expect the outcome B to be, how much clarity I expect on the workshop goals, how happy I am about that, or how happy I expect to be about that situation. Then I'm going to take whichever action A gives the highest value in that argmax. That's going to be the A that this model predicts I actually take.
Yeah.
Whew. All right. So even though it looks like weirdly loopy, it's surprisingly not that loopy.
Okay. I mean, it's one loop.
Yeah. It's one loop. There's not like an infinite regress or anything like that. Now, partially that's because we're doing a causal decision theorist that just immediately grounds out. With some other kind of decision theory, it might be more complicated, but it doesn't have to be.
Okay. All right. Is that it then?
That's it then, unless you have any other questions that you want to...
Did this get you what you wanted?
I think so.
What did you want? I probably should have asked that at the beginning.
So this was... let's stop the recording first. This doesn't need to go. Presentation.